Well, thank you for the invitation to come and be a part of the wrapping up of this. And thank you to everybody who's participated so far today. It's been overwhelming. What we thought that we would do is to try to draw together some questions that maybe allow you to take what you've seen and heard today home with you, so that you think a little bit different perhaps on Monday, or at least for me, so that I think a little bit different on Monday from what I did this morning at 9 o'clock. Because it's really been a privilege to see the projects and to see the experience that these people have had who've come together to speak today. And a lot of it may seem as if it's very removed from the everyday reality of practice here in Norway. So to try to distill somehow out of that a few questions that we can take with us, I think would be a worthwhile thing to do. So obviously, you know, we've been talking a little bit in the breaks and about the topics of today: participation, exchange, and communication, and what that might mean. And so that's where we'll try to start, and somehow taking those terms. You know, everyone has asked those questions already. What is it actually? What is communication? Does exchange really mean? Obviously, it all depends. And somehow, a thing that's very instrumental to me, and that is the nature of language. You know, how do we talk to each other? What do we say? What level of abstraction can we use? Do we talk to each other? Do we talk to other people? And so language and abstraction is one of the things that we would like to talk about a little bit. Then the issue of exchange is really to do with responsibility. Bijoy talked about it. You know, how do you engage with people? What responsibility do you take? What responsibility has the architect let go or relinquished in recent years, and what can we take responsibility for? What should we take responsibility for? And then, of course, participation involves somehow the issue of education. What do we prepare people for in architecture schools? What do we prepare people for when in the architectural and in the design process? We all need to educate each other also in that process. So there are a lot of big words to start to grapple with, and to somehow try to distill those things into questions. But the main question for me through all of this is really, what do you want? What do you want? Well, you know, what are we doing? What are we trying to achieve? If you want to make a better world, I guess, you know, what is that? What do you want? When you're talking to someone, who are you talking to, and what are you trying to achieve in that conversation? So, I mean, that would be my first question to you guys. You know, what do you want?
If I just continue on a thought, I think maybe one thing that I've thought about is for architects to understand possibly the limitations of what they can do, and in knowing that limitation, something really, you know, like essentialized can be optimized. And I'll explain a little bit. Maybe part of that is also understanding what we're talking about, as you're saying. What is architecture and what is not architecture? And I'm reminded of Daniel's presentation where he said, you know, this number of 2% of all buildings are done by architects. And it's not a lot, so why are we talking about all of this? What's all this energy going into? And I think that's where we can make a differentiation between what we understand as architecture and what are simply buildings. And by doing that, we can talk about things. Architecture is something that happens outside of building culture as well, and participate in those fields. A building is simply, you know, a structure that, you know, keeps us, you know, from the weather. It's made by someone, not necessarily an architect. It could be made by anyone, and it doesn't necessarily impart architectural kind of desire. It wasn't desired to be anything more than just some kind of shelter. And then I would suggest a provisional definition of architecture as at least a spatial practice. a body of knowledge that deals with everything from context, politics, history, society, structure, and space, of course. And so some kind of spatial practice of that we can call as architecture. And it may manifest itself as a building, or a text piece, or art piece, or something else. But in thinking about those terms, I think what everyone can take home is how can architecture with, let's call it with a big A, you know, how can we take architecture and put that into a building design process?
But Carson, I mean, obviously in principle, I don't disagree with you. I guess for me, what it raises is 2 points that Ingrid brought up, and something that Bijoy and Jeffrey were each touching on, was the idea of responsibility, or the idea that in a way the architect has given up too much, or this sort of expanded spatial practice for, not necessarily for within the discourse of architecture, but for people outside the discourse of architecture. It's very difficult to establish or explain what it is, and not only that, but to establish a particular value that's attached to this. I mean, Jeffrey, I was listening as Jeff talked, and you know, the idea of, he didn't necessarily address the issue overtly, but the word value kept coming up. That in a way, a lot of what you do in C-Lab and a lot of what you do either through any of the media you use, whether it's printed media, images, sort of building itself, conferences, whatever, is to sort of make people understand the value of what you do, or the sort of value of architecture.
And I would say what you're talking about then is we've relinquished a lot in our building design practice, and we've gained in architectural, you know, value.
Well, this is what I thought you were going, when you said the limitations, I said, well, I thought, well, I totally disagree, because if there's anything that today has shown, is that there is no limitations really to what architects can engage in and somehow bring an organizational knowledge to, a spatial organizational knowledge, whatever you want to say. So in a way, that's exactly the point that you're making, that even when you're not doing building, even if you're not doing buildings, even in the preparation for buildings or in conversations about spaces and spatial organizations, there is always something that can be
precisely. But I guess that's the flip side of it's the new question that arises, and the question I asked Jeffrey: what's at stake in calling this architecture, and at one point is it simply something else? And I think that's what's getting interesting right now. At what are the disciplinary boundaries of architecture?
But maybe one thing that was really interesting about what you said before was this notion of maybe replacing the word architecture, or this idea of architectural production, with, more generally speaking, the production of space. And what does that production of space entail in terms of lots of different disciplinary kind of intakes? And I think one of the things that we talked about before was education. And I think what's really interesting is that we often perceive education at the academy as something where you can experiment, but then what's kind of very confusing and sad is that with a lot of people, the moment that they step out of these kind of academic environments into the real world, it kind of almost disappears completely. And that's not only, I mean, with kind of, let's say, more technical schools, but that's also the case with really experimental schools. So you see a lot of students actually leaving very experimental schools, and they're going straight into kind of big offices kind of at mid-level. So I'm wondering what needs to be done in terms of almost like a kind of ongoing education. And very interestingly, I see, for example, volume as a kind of media that, for me, it's almost like kind of ongoing educational project. So I think those means are very interesting.
But I think, especially Craig's presentation today shows what is possible even within a setup where all the expectations are completely conventional, right? You work in a commercial situation in America where your clients obviously, you know, come to you with certain expectations, but it's a conventional process, and within that there are actually lots of possibilities, and also the examples from Copenhagen. You know, this is in a way just a question of bringing imagination to the situation, and you assume that people will react, I guess, negatively because it's experimental, so therefore it's time wasting, or it's you know, risky or whatever. But a lot of people are interested in entering into those processes. I mean, that seems to be Craig's message today. You know, it's amazing what you can get people to do if you just ask them. I mean, even the example from Stavanger as well, right? And the processes there. Most people are really happy to be part of something special. And we can make that happen for them, you know?
I think continuing with this education idea, and I was thinking, and something I addressed a little bit in my introduction, is how is architecture or building design, you know, or both, communicated in architecture schools? And it is this kind of problem that, you know, we're talking about designing processes and things that develop and workflows and strategies for operating spatially in the world. But you know, as I said, like someone coming out of high school goes into architecture school often wanting to, you know, be Frank Gehry and build Bilbao, you know. So to give them an assignment and say, okay, now analyze the situation and design a kind of strategy, a 5-step strategy for
to become
this,
Frank Gehry.
No, for this and this to happen, for some kind of, you know, social process. There's a kind of like disconnect in desire. So I'm almost thinking that all these things can happen out of school, but in school, there's something very valuable about learning how to design a building, and that studios can and I sound like I'm flipping back and forth between different ideas, but when you design a building, you have to bring together, there's a special knowledge that architects gain when they think about the different forces at work in putting one thing together. The budget, the client, the needs of, the demands of the context, the political situation, the size, the atmosphere, the experience of being in the space, and putting all those together into one kind of thing in the world produces a very specific imagination. And I think it's kind of in terms of education, it's after school that one can activate this imagination in any which way to do any sorts of different things. But I would kind of advocate like within school, because I think it's, and I was talking to Tor Inge another time, that it's a kind of a question in Norway, a continuing question: how does one educate the architect? Yeah.
Well, there is a specific knowledge which you need to have. I mean, we are after all taking part in shaping the built environment. You know, so you need to have a knowledge to bring to that discussion. But then, given that, obviously there are a number of, I think you counted 250 different participants or agencies that you had to talk to. So obviously you have to be prepared for a lot more. But then, if you concentrate on building design in schools, I mean building design, then how do you prepare architectural students, architects, for those processes that they need to take part in, all those other conversations?
Really problematic, because what often
how do you
happens,
weigh the time between those things? You know, because it's complicated to. It takes
I mean,
a lot
if
of
you're
knowledge.
only used
Takes
to
a lot of
building
time to
design
design
studios, I mean, I'm absolutely agreeing with you that it is a very important process to learn these design processes, also because they can be like very easily abstracted and applied into other areas. But at the same time, I think if you only ever are a member, let's say, of kind of classic design studios designing buildings, and you're only ever spending your time in the academy, this transition from the academy to the outside almost by default then means that a lot of people end up in offices because they're totally not prepared for any other kind of work, which, for example, also includes a lot of communication, because they haven't learned it.
I mean, it could also be that the idea that architecture now is a sort of expanded spatial practice, or an expanded, a critical spatial practice in which critical thinking becomes crucial, right? How do you think through and design these processes, the protocols, the interfaces? That there are different, I mean, it's like if you go to school for art history, okay, everybody doesn't study modern, right? Some people study medieval, you know, Baroque, Renaissance, whatever. It could be that there are different facets of an expanded spatial practice in which people choose to specialize. Maybe there are some core components, but that even happens now in terms of a sort of global education. If you go to Germany, you get one type of education which might be more technical. If you go to the AA, you get a different type of education. Harvard is something else. So it could be that the education, in a sense, also has to expand to accommodate these different facets of the discipline.
I mean, I think that architects or people that come out of school will I don't know if I'm being optimistic, but they adapt to different situations, and I think that's a particular quality of architects. Maybe it's the very special kind of imagination that's developed when one thinks about making a building that I'm trying to. Kind of,
yeah, but you are talking as if an architect is an architect.
Is a building designer.
Yeah.
No, in school.
And this is somehow also a problematic thing, right? Because all those specialties already exist, and there are already a lot of architects doing a lot of different things. But somehow we don't seem to be reaping the benefit of that in terms of the self-image of the profession.
Well, I mean,
because we are seen as a particular type of professional. Yeah. And we talk about ourselves in terms of for example, the lack of our presence in the public debate. So there's no architects in the public debate, as if the architect is a person that should be up there saying a thing on behalf of all other architects. I mean, there are as many opinions as there are architectural practitioners.
But this could be interesting, actually, to follow up with Markus and the idea of participation, which you've been invested in so many years, and today we've seen so many different models of it. There's I guess Bijoy's kind of actual participating in like hands-on kind of situations, and let's say Christina's where and Craig's to a degree as well, where the public in fact participate in a very kind of I guess constructive way. In your introduction, you were talking about participation and the potentials of a non-constructive, dissensual form of participation as a forced entry. So I'm curious about your reaction to these presentations.
Well, I mean, that would be a very long conversation, but I think I think one thing that I would like to pick up on in this context is something that I think Jeff said, if I remember correctly, which was to do with the simulation of participation. I think it was you. I think it's a very interesting one because, I mean, one thing that I said in my introduction was this kind of almost like newly constructed paradigm of new labor, and then also in Holland, the Polder model, which really uses this idea of consensus and participation as a way to kind of almost cop out of their responsibility. And although I think these projects where there is all these kind of participatory structures are very interesting, I'm wondering also to which extent they are simulation of participation. And I mean, my real doubt would be as someone on the other side, i.e. as the person who's supposed to participate. I mean, I'm wondering personally, like, who actually has the time to do all this?
Well, when you say these projects, what do you mean? Because we've seen things on a lot of different scales and with different intentions today.
Okay, so for example, let's say online projects where you as a user are supposed to somehow take part and make decisions or even become part of the design. I think maybe in the kind of design process it's slightly different because if you're actually one of the immediate stakeholders, there's probably kind of immediate interest also to kind of get involved. But I mean, I'm very skeptical about all these kind of new communication devices, I have to say, because I mean, if you really do take them serious, which I think it's great if people do that, and then it's also very enjoyable to see the products that are coming out of this. But with that kind of influx of those, whatever these things are, like whether it's Facebook or whether it's other kind of new applications, to quite an kind of extent, they're not really being taken serious, I think. And the kind of stuff that it produces, also with blogs. I mean, there's a lot of blog writing, but I'm always wondering, okay, I mean, who actually has the time to really do this? And if so, what are really the products that are coming out of this? And maybe this is kind of skeptical.
No, but there's a question of scale, which is interesting, because and the projects that we saw in Paris, the very small scale things at the beginning of the day, where the relationships and the participation, everything is very direct, it's very visible, it's very specific, and the effects of the process are there immediately, and everybody's input is manifest and material and somehow indisputable, right? But as soon as you're dealing with larger groups, where you have to systematize and organize things, it is very easy for all those political intentions to become dispersed. So is it possible to keep the same activism that it has a consequence also on a larger scale?
It's exactly what worries me, because I think this kind of easiness of the process is why it makes me feel really skeptical. Because if you look, and this happens a lot with these virtual projects, because if you look at actual, so let's take Teddy's project as an example. If you look at actual stuff, where an individual or group decides that they're going to set up the parameters for a certain project, which means that you actually have to get quite involved, you're constantly hitting also moments of frustration, you're constantly hitting conflict, and it's really bloody hard work to push even for the most small kind of changes. And yeah, I don't know, now you should say something, but that's partially what produces this kind of skepticism.
Tina, did you have a comment on that?
No, it was just that it's the idea of when does I think the pitfall is when participation becomes a sort of end in itself, right? That the participatory process is exalted simply by the fact that it's participatory. And you have to look at how these processes then become, let's say, productive or implemented or whatever, beyond just a sort of, a utopian idea.
Or a symbolic
a symbolic gesture.
Makes people
or a
feel
sort of
good,
virtual
but has no
gesture.
consequence whatsoever.
Right. Now, there might be a productive nature in that virtual gesture. You know, there might be some way that it begins to mobilize something. But I think part of what Markus is saying, again, goes back to B-Joy, is that there still needs to be somebody driving the car, ultimately.
So the question then is responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And we have already several people who have talked about the responsibility that the architect has relinquished for various parts of the process, because there are certain things that we don't have any power over, and there are developers and there are other people and so on. Hasn't it always been like that? I mean, we have never paid for our own buildings, right? At any point in history. So that relationship of responsibility, in a way, has always been like that. So why does that feel so different now? When most people in this room are anyway in a situation where you every day have conversations with all the people who are involved in these processes.
It's not the paying part, but I think it's the kind of continued kind of abstraction of the role of the building designer. That doesn't do the statics, doesn't do the kind of. It's a bit removed.
They're removed from the material process.
But I think if we can bring it back to kind of social.
But we never built the buildings either, and we never engineered them. So why do architects now feel more powerless, presumably, than they did 50 years ago?
I don't.
Because this is the sense I get, not only from today, but from a lot of similar gatherings, like, oh, we're not part of this, and we're not part of that, and we don't get to decide this, and no one appreciates what we do, and we just want the best for the world, and somehow we never get there, right? I mean, there is a kind of feeling of powerlessness.
I mean, I think
which luckily I don't see in any of the people who presented today, so that
yeah.
in itself is energizing, you know, but I get that sense. But I don't think we're historically in a different position than we ever were.
I mean, I think we are in the sense that the larger picture is that we don't have the same kind of utopian or modernist kind of dream that says architecture can fix things.
So the world's changed.
Well, because we have new responsibilities now.
Yeah.
You know, there's climate is, green architecture. They've become not only they've become moral questions, and they weren't in the past. And so, but before
or we chose not to see them. I mean, building Versailles, there is a moral question there as well.
Pyramids,
right?
whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to get too much into, let's say, economic realities, but I think I don't know exactly about the situation in Norway, and I'm sure it's kind of much more safe, let's say, than some other European countries. But for example, I'm living in Berlin, which is a city with 5,000 unemployed architects, and I don't think I mean, I'm not surprised, let's say, that people are questioning like why certain things are happening, and why they're maybe also questioning their role, or why they're trying to reinvent their role to a certain extent.
I mean, I think
that happens in other places too.
But people are cluing into the fact that you don't need an architect to build a building, but not in a very kind of grassroots way, but in a pretty sophisticated way. You can build kind of beautiful skyscrapers that look architectural without an architect, you know. And so I think this goes back to the idea of the expanded role.
It also doesn't matter whether you are a card-carrying bona fide architect to come out of Harvard or the AA or whatever. You can still build shit buildings. An architect, you know, that's someone designed those skyscrapers, and I'm not passing any judgment on anybody that I might like to name, but you know. So what an architect actually is and what they can contribute varies from person to person as well. So it's somehow about all the people around the table.
But I think what's really important to talk about somehow is how kind of other forms of, however we want to call it, critical spatial practice, practices that are involved in the production of space, how these processes and these practices can actually be acknowledged, so that they will also be understood from the outside as something that not only contributes to architecture,
that's a good point,
but to a kind of
broader discourse, broader mode of practice. How do we begin to argue for again, I come back to the same thing, but how do we begin to argue for the value of that, or the place of that, or the position that begins to occupy? How does that gain a certain sort of recognition?
So it's about the construction of the image of the architect then that needs to be extended for the skills that we actually have to offer society.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, in a space like this is much easier, or at least a little bit easier, let's say, than in a context where you're talking to complete outsiders or people that are not immediately involved with the field of architecture, urbanism, or spatial planning. But then, of course, it becomes very difficult. And I think that's something where this issue of communication becomes incredibly important, because how do you bridge that gap?
And I thought, how great would it be if, you know, if Arab Spring and, you know, the different kind of like mass kind of gathering of protests happened because an architect architected it, you know, and willed it, and thought spatially about, you know, these squares and how people can actually and start to use them in a strong way. The way that someone can imagine people occupying Notre Dame or something. But today, with the communication tools, with the things that we have at hand, to have that kind of imagination and affect space powerfully in that way.
And not only an architect, but someone architected it.
Yeah.
We don't have time. There are people here who want to do stuff.
Well,
right?
I understand. It's just that it would have been nice to open it up to the audience to, you know, at least I would like to say something myself. Yep. But in terms of, you know, in terms of the conversation here, several other conversations.
It has to be very short. Very short. But I will note one thing, which is what you did. You made architecture into a verb. Right? A verb.
To architect.
To architect someone.
It's still coming from the United States at this moment, when I'm thinking, just your last comment about the Spring Revolution or whatever, but I've been thinking how many Wall Street bailouts, foreclosures, defunding on health, infrastructure, education will take to prompt our own Spring Revolution in the United States. I've been thinking about it. It seems to me that Tahrir Square will never occur there, of course. Why? Because there is not a kind of overt sense of urgency. And this is what is missing from our field. It's not to say we should not polarize, and I'm glad Craig brought it up, you know, anymore, this issue of formalist versus non-formalist versus... Of course, all of us are trying to be productive, entrepreneurial in shaping alternative practices to deal with some of these issues. Some of us take detours in order to get to architecture. No advances in housing design, in my mind, can be achieved without advances at this moment in housing policy, in housing economy, and so on. The point is that we continue to be very distant and is yet therefore powerless in the context of current socio-political and economic realities. And that would require, I think, or prompt our profession to rethink certain tools and certain processes. So in that sense, and I'm coming from New York where I spent 3 days, or even San Diego, and somebody mentioned what differentiates our economic crisis right now from the one in 1928 is that, at least in 28, that reality was overtly in front of our eyes on the streets. It hasn't gotten to us. The world's about to collapse out there, not only in the United States, but in Europe right now. It's a very, very radical moment. And yet, there is not the sense of urgency that prompts certain redefinition of work protocols, production of other arrangements, and so on. Therefore, I think, yes, the architect continues to be subordinated to other forces. And also to say that probably those are the limitations. This is a question that needs to be opened up. I think some of us could become developers of alternative economic performance or other, in essence, I'm just wanted to, say this because we are ending a conference about probably 70% of us talked about alternative practices that produce maybe other approaches, let's say, to building. But we need to frame the discussion right now, I think, in the unprecedented sense of crisis and urgency that is out there.
I think it's super interesting. Maybe I just have a question for you, Teddy, which is, do you think that there is no urgency because the phenomenon itself is something that is virtual rather than spatial?
Because we continue to wait for the clients to give us the commissions. Generally speaking, some of us are lucky to get...
but on one level, the architect is a citizen like any other citizen.
The size of research, I've been thinking about it. While in the last years of glamorous economy, the creative intelligence of our fields fled or moved in mass to Dubai and China to catapult those places again as the emblematic kind of global city. Not very, very few things were advanced when it comes to infrastructure or the role really of architecture in the context of these realities I'm speaking of. The most incredible experimental advances occurred in Latin America by willful, in fact, political leaders that embrace social networks, informal economies, other modalities of development, not in the predictable size of intervention, but in fact in the midst of marginality. So we need to seek other sides of research, other roles, other role models, I think, in the context of what we are doing, primarily in environments that are wealthy, that are monocultural. The world is shifting, and I think the impact of immigration, the shifting of geopolitical, all of these really continue to be peripheral to what we do in general in terms of our profession.
We will have to continue the discussion in the bar, in the cafes, around the city, whatever parties we're going to over the next couple of days.
Is there some time for questions?
No, I'm sorry. We're finished 15 minutes ago. But people will still be around. Grab them, ask questions of each other, ask questions of your clients on Monday morning. Thank you, Markus. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Carson. Thanks to you for coming.
Sorry.